Mark Levin never imagined that the young Congresswoman sitting across from him would be the reason his political armor would crack. Just a few days before the hearing, he had smiled wide on live television, making a snide remark about freshman lawmakers with no battlefield experience trying to play soldier in suits. He wasn't subtle, and he didn't have to be. That's what made him so popular with his base. The Alabama senator had built a reputation on being blunt, old school, and unbothered. For him, politics was just another sideline, and he was still calling the plays. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett sat quietly in her office 2 floors above the Capitol cafeteria, sipping coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Outside her window, autumn leaves blew down Constitution Avenue, and tourists with cameras lingered around the steps of the Capitol building, not knowing the storm brewing inside. Jasmine's desk was covered in documents, charts, family testimonies, official military promotion stats, but her hand rested on a single white envelope slightly creased at the edges. She hadn't opened it yet. She didn't need to. She already knew what it said. Her father had called the night before, his voice even and calm like always. "It's not just about you, Jazz," he'd said. "It's about all of them. So if you're going to speak for them too." That was how he was. Always bigger than his own story, always thinking about the others. Her team was in the middle of prepping for the hearing. Avery, her chief of staff, was leaning over a laptop, showing a spreadsheet full of promotion delays, names, ranks, dates, impacts. "We've got over 60 confirmed families affected just in the last 2 months. That's not counting the ones too afraid to come forward." Jasmine nodded. "What about personal stories?" she asked. "We've pulled about 15 strong ones. There's a Navy commander whose family can't buy a house because his orders are frozen. An Air Force colonel's retirement's on hold. And then the mental health counselor from Fort Hood, her caseload's doubled since this mess started." Jasmine leaned back, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Good. We need more than data. We need to make it real, personal." Across the room, Marcus, the intern with a knack for finding the emotional thread in every policy, piped up. "Ma'am, your father served 3 tours, right?" Jasmine looked over, surprised. "That's right." "Well, he ever write about it?" Marcus asked. "He did," Jasmine replied quietly. "Last night." She picked up the envelope again. It felt heavier than paper should. Her fingers traced the edge, not ready to open it yet. There was something sacred about it, something final. It wasn't just a message from a father to his daughter. It was a statement from a soldier who had given more to this country than most people could imagine. Avery glanced at the clock. "We've got 3 days. You sure you want to open with policy and not go straight to the personal?" Jasmine shook her head. "Let them talk first. Let them lay out their positions, show their strategy. I'll go last." She paused, eyes still on the envelope. "And I'll go deep." Outside, tourists were gathering for the last tour of the day. A group of veterans in matching ball caps were having their photo taken on the Capitol steps. Jasmine's gaze lingered on them for a moment. There was something about older vets, the quiet way they carried themselves, how their shoulders stayed square even in old age. They didn't need to say they had served. You could see it. Later that evening, Jasmine sat alone in the office. The staff had gone home. The city was quieting down. The envelope was still unopened on the desk next to a small photo frame that held a picture of her as a child sitting on her father's lap, both of them in matching Air Force shirts. She picked up the envelope again and finally opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, lined handwritten in blue ink. No dramatic preamble, no underlines, just her father's even, precise handwriting. She didn't read it aloud. Not yet. She folded it again, carefully, deliberately. Then she slid it back into the envelope and placed it inside her leather folder, the one she used only for occasions that mattered. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached for her coat, flicked off the office light, and walked down the empty hallway, heels clicking against the marble floor. As she stepped outside, the wind had picked up. The flag above the Capitol rippled sharply, silhouetted against a gray sky. 3 days. In 3 days, the senator would laugh, and she would answer with more than words. The next morning, the Capitol was already buzzing before the sun fully cleared the horizon. Jasmine arrived early, as she always did. There was something about the silence of those wide marble corridors at dawn, like the building itself was catching its breath before the noise began. She greeted the janitor, Mr. Wilkins, who always wore a worn navy cap, and offered a quiet morning Congresswoman as he wheeled his cart down the hall. She paused, reached into her bag, and handed him a wrapped muffin. "Banana nut your favorite," she smiled. "That's why you're my favorite," he winked. In her office, Avery was already going over the updated hearing schedule. Levin's been moved to the middle slot. They're giving him extra time, probably planning to grandstand a little. Jasmine gave a knowing smirk. Let him talk. Across the Capitol, Senator Mark Levin was prepping in his own way, laughing with aides, sipping sweet tea from a tumbler with his name on it in block letters, and rehearsing one-liners he could drop mid-hearing. If she wants to talk about promotions, maybe she should first get promoted from theory to reality, he quipped. His staff chuckled on cue. He liked that. That feeling of control, of having the room before he even stepped into it. Jasmine, by contrast, was reviewing personal letters. She had printed testimonies from military families, many handwritten. There were letters from service members stuck overseas, waiting on new command chains from spouses trying to keep families together without leadership on base, from children missing ceremonies because their parents' promotions were indefinitely frozen. Her eyes stopped on one in particular, a letter from a 16-year-old girl named Brielle. Her dad, a lieutenant colonel, had missed her junior ROTC award ceremony because of the delay. I know he wanted to be there. He said he was proud, but they wouldn't let him leave base. Said they didn't know who would replace him. I smiled for pictures, but it felt weird. I'm proud of him. I just wish the people making the rules understood what that means. Jasmine folded the paper carefully and added it to the folder with her father's letter. Later that day, during a private lunch with a few fellow lawmakers, someone asked if she was nervous. She shook her head. I'm not nervous. I'm just ready. I don't think he is. Back in her office that evening, Jasmine stood looking out the window again. The trees that had still held a few yellow leaves earlier that week now looked bare. The weather was shifting. You could feel it. And in politics, timing was everything. She pulled out a sticky note and scribbled something. Then she taped it to the inside of her leather folder. Speak truth, but don't forget who you're speaking for. She didn't stay late that night. Instead, she left the building just after 6 p.m., took a walk past the Capitol reflecting pool, and sat for a few minutes near the Grant Memorial. Tourists were gone. The city felt older in the evening, quieter, more honest. She pulled out her phone and called her father. Hey, Daddy. Hey, baby girl. You ready? I think so, she said, her voice soft. You ain't gotta think. You are. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. That's how he had always been, sharp when needed, but gentle when it counted. Jasmine stayed there a while longer before heading home. The next day would be full of headlines and commentary. The day after that would be louder. But in that moment, under a deepening twilight, she allowed herself one quiet breath, one steady inhale. She was ready. And 3 days later, when Mark Levin laughed, she would remind him and everyone else watching what it meant to grow up in the shadow of real service. Mark Levin grinned, for the cameras convinced no one in that room could match his military rhetoric. The hearing room was already half full before the clock struck 9. Staffers shuffled papers, reporters scribbled notes, and military families filled the gallery with quiet tension. Some wore military pins, others held photographs in their hands. A Gold Star mother clutched a framed picture of her son, her fingers tracing the edges over and over as if holding on to something fragile. Senator Levin walked in like he owned the place. The familiar slow stride, the folksy nods to colleagues, the perfectly timed smile for the press, all calculated, all practiced. He paused before taking a seat, glancing up at the crowd in the gallery. That same cocky grin curved across his face when he spotted the cameras positioned at the back. His aide leaned in. You're up second right after Chairman Wilson opens. Levin nodded. Good. Gives me time to warm the place up. He adjusted his cufflinks, then checked his talking points one last time, not because he needed them, but because he liked the feel of control. The man had never served a day in uniform, but he'd made a career out of sounding like he had. Years of coaching football, commanding locker rooms, speaking at military-themed rallies, it gave him just enough air of authority to bluff his way through. And bluff he did often and well. When the hearing officially opened, Chairman Wilson offered a brief neutral welcome, then dove straight into the agenda: military promotions readiness, impact family support issues, the kind of things that sounded dry on paper but were deeply personal to the people sitting in the gallery. Levin's turn came quickly. He cleared his throat, leaned forward with a practiced casualness, and began. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleagues for taking time to be here. Now, I know this topic has stirred up some emotion lately. That's understandable. But we have to remember something important. This isn't about feelings. It's about principles." He paused, letting that settle. "I've spent decades working with young men who've gone on to serve. I've seen firsthand what discipline, structure, and sacrifice look like. And let me tell you, our military isn't falling apart because of delayed promotions. It's falling apart because we've gotten too political about who gets to serve, how they serve, and what we prioritize." Some members shifted in their seats. Levin continued. "Now, some folks like to paint this as a crisis. They say careers are being ruined, families are being torn apart. I understand that perspective. I really do. But I also believe in standing firm when it counts." His tone hardened slightly. "Politics should not dictate who leads our military. And if that means some discomfort along the way, well, real leadership ain't supposed to be comfortable." A few Republicans nodded. Cameras clicked. Levin leaned back, flashing a knowing smile. "I've heard it said that I don't understand military life because I didn't serve, that I'm just a coach, a guy with a whistle. Well, let me tell you something. Coaches know more about combat than most people in this room. Every week we face down pressure, lead young people through adversity, and make calls that impact futures. Sound familiar?" Jasmine Crockett sat motionless across the room, her folder resting on the table before her. She didn't interrupt. She didn't flinch. Levin glanced her way briefly before adding, "And some new folks want to act like they're experts on the military just because they read a few reports or talk to a few veterans." He didn't say her name, but everyone knew who he meant. "In my view," he said, "if you've never been on a battlefield, maybe don't act like you know what it takes to lead one." The room held its breath. Jasmine kept her eyes on her notes, calm, steady. Levin concluded, "Let's not confuse passion with experience. Let's not let politics get in the way of real leadership." "Thank you." Applause was sparse, but the message had landed at least for his base. Back in the gallery, a woman whispered to her husband, "Did he really just say that?" The man in a well-worn army dress uniform didn't reply. He just stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Chairman Wilson thanked the senator and moved on to the next speaker, but the tone had shifted. A crackle of something electric passed through the room. Journalists scribbled faster. Jasmine flipped a page in her notes, her fingers brushing against the edge of the envelope tucked inside. Outside the chamber in a nearby hallway, Levin met briefly with a reporter. "What did you think?" he asked, adjusting his tie. "You think it hit?" The reporter raised an eyebrow. "You sure you want to come at a military kid that hard?" Levin chuckled. "It's politics. She'll be fine. Probably already drafting her rebuttal. Lawyers love the sound of their own voice." Inside, Jasmine continued listening as another member spoke. She didn't react, didn't turn toward the hallway, didn't take the bait. But her pen moved. She was underlining something, a statistic about promotion delays for dual military families. Later, as the room paused for a short recess, Jasmine walked quietly toward the gallery. She didn't go up the steps. She just stood near the railing and nodded toward a woman holding a photo. The woman smiled faintly, then said, "My son's been waiting for 9 months. He's missed 2 moves, 1 promotion, and his daughter's birth." Jasmine placed a hand gently over hers. "We see you, all of you. This isn't just data, it's lives." Back in her seat, she opened her folder briefly. Her father's letter was still there, untouched since that night. She didn't need to read it again to remember what it said, but just knowing it was there gave her spine. Levin watched her from the corner of his eye. She hadn't spoken yet, and that made him nervous. Silence was harder to read than rage, and Jasmine Crockett had the kind of silence that said, "I'm not reacting. I'm preparing." He leaned back, let out a soft chuckle, and scribbled a note on his legal pad. Courtroom kids don't win real battles. But he didn't realize something Jasmine had known all along. Sometimes the loudest thing in the room isn't a voice, it's the truth, and hers was about to speak. The second half of the hearing resumed with a panel of military family advocates providing testimony. Their statements were measured but powerful, laced with facts and grounded in lived experience. One advocate, a soft-spoken Army spouse named Carla, shared a story about her husband's command being stuck in limbo for 7 months. "He's a lieutenant colonel with 18 years of service," she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "We've moved 9 times. Our kids have had to restart their lives every 2 or 3 years. And now, because a promotion is frozen over politics, he's leading a unit he's not technically authorized to lead, while his replacement can't even step in. We've been told to just wait, but when you've already given everything, waiting feels like erasure." Jasmine leaned forward, making notes. Not for performance, not for sound bites, but to make sure she remembered Carla's name, her words. Those were the people she was speaking for. Meanwhile, Levin checked his phone under the table, smirking, as he scrolled through a tweet quoting one of his earlier lines. "Passion is not experience." "Good pull," he muttered. But for every social media clip praising his toughness, there were more flooding in from military families, veterans and active duty members criticizing the tone of his remarks. Jasmine's team monitored it quietly in the background, not letting it distract from what mattered, the stories being told in that room. As the hearing drew closer to the final round of remarks, Jasmine quietly slipped out of the room and walked a short loop around the hallway. Her heels echoed softly against the marble. A few visitors recognized her, but no one stopped her. She looked calm on the outside, but inside her thoughts were sharpening. She passed a portrait of Barbara Jordan, paused, then exhaled. "Lead with dignity," she whispered, not as a mantra, but as a memory. Her father had told her once that service wasn't about proving your worth. It was about standing tall so others could lean on you. When she re-entered the hearing room, something had shifted. Her presence was quiet but commanding. She wasn't in a hurry. Her movements were deliberate. The folder was still in her hand. Levin watched her with narrowed eyes. "She's going to try something," he muttered to his aide. "Probably wrap herself in some sob story." His aide hesitated. "Senator, you might want to back off the personal stuff." But Levin was already in too deep. As the final round began, Chairman Wilson glanced at the clock, then at the remaining names. "Congresswoman Crockett, you have the floor." She adjusted the mic slowly, hands steady. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman." She began, her voice low but clear. "I'd like to use my time to ask a few questions and then share something on behalf of the families represented in this room and those watching at home." She turned toward Levin, not hostile but firm. "Senator Levin," she said, "do you believe that using military families as leverage for political disagreement strengthens or weakens our national defense?" Levin leaned into his mic. "Congresswoman, I appreciate the question, but I'd argue this isn't about politics. It's about principle." Jasmine nodded. "That's interesting, because I've spoken to over 50 families in the last 2 weeks alone, and none of them feel like their lives are being guided by principle. Most say they feel like pawns." Levin offered a thin smile. "Sometimes hard decisions feel that way. That's leadership." Jasmine let the silence hang for a moment. "Did you ever serve in the military?" Senator Levin's smile tightened. "No, but I've spent decades around military folks, and I—" She gently interrupted. "So no direct service." He shifted. "As I said, I've been around." "And do you believe," she continued, "that being around military personnel gives you the same depth of understanding as someone raised in a military household? Someone who's lived that experience?" Levin opened his mouth, but she didn't wait for the answer. "I ask because I'd like to share a letter," she said. "It was written by someone who did serve. 22 years, 3 tours in Vietnam, Bronze Star. He also happens to be my father." Levin blinked. Jasmine reached into her folder and pulled out the envelope, slowly, calmly. "I'll read it in full during my closing. But for now, I just want to note, when someone who's actually lived military life writes about its meaning, I tend to listen." She tucked the envelope back into the folder. Silence. Even Levin didn't smile this time. After the session adjourned, Jasmine exited without speaking to reporters. Her team followed in step. The mood was quiet, focused. Avery glanced back at the chamber. "He's not laughing anymore," she said. "No," Jasmine replied, "but he will." They knew what was coming. So did the country. When Jasmine Crockett finally spoke, her words weren't loud, but they hit harder than any political jab. She had waited long enough. Mark Levin had taken his shot smug behind his microphone, confident in his assumptions. But this moment wasn't about him. It wasn't even about her. It was about every family sitting in the gallery, every military kid who'd slept in a different state every 2 years, every spouse who'd sat through deployment holidays with a smile for the kids and a pit in their stomach, every soldier who'd missed a wedding, a birth, or a funeral, all because duty called. The hearing room had settled into a restless quiet. Jasmine adjusted her chair, her hands steady as she opened her folder. Levin was watching her closely now, that same smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, like a man who thought he already knew how the story ended. Jasmine cleared her throat. "Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask a few final questions before I yield my time." Wilson nodded. "Proceed, Congresswoman." She turned slightly, making direct eye contact with Levin for the first time that day. "Senator Levin, earlier you referenced your time coaching young men and compared that experience to military leadership. Is that correct?" Levin leaned into his mic ready. "That's right. I stand by it." "You also mentioned that, in your view, people without direct military service shouldn't claim to understand what service members go through. Is that also correct?" A pause. Levin smiled faintly. "In general, yes. I think there's a big difference between reading about the military and living it." Jasmine nodded. "I agree. There is a difference." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward, but something in her tone made the room still. "You see," she continued, "while I've never worn the uniform, I grew up folding them." There was a slight shift in the gallery, a murmur quickly quieted. "My father, Master Sergeant James Crockett, served 22 years in the United States Air Force, 3 tours in Vietnam, Bronze Star. He taught me how to shine boots before I learned how to tie my shoes. I learned to recognize rank before I could spell my own name. I spent birthdays beside an empty chair, moved cities more times than I can count, and learned that home wasn't a place, it was wherever my family landed between orders." Levin's smirk had faded, replaced by something harder to read. "I don't bring this up to ask for sympathy," she continued, "because every military kid in this room could tell you the same story. But I bring it up because you, Senator, laughed." Gasps were barely audible, but they rippled nonetheless. "You laughed when I asked about the human cost of delayed promotions. You laughed when I shared stories from real families living under real strain. And you laughed when you assumed that I, someone who didn't serve, had no right to speak on behalf of those who did." She reached into her folder and lifted the envelope slowly. "This morning, my father gave me something. A letter. He wrote it after watching your interviews, hearing your comments. He asked me to share it not for me, but for every military family who doesn't have a microphone." Levin shifted in his seat, visibly tense. "I'll read the letter later," she said softly. "But before I do, I want to say one thing." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. But it carried. "Coaching a football team doesn't make you a soldier. And using military rhetoric while holding up careers doesn't make you a patriot." The gallery was silent now. Not the awkward silence of politics, but the reverent kind, the kind you find in memorials, in cemeteries, in chapels. Levin leaned forward, attempting to regain ground. "Congresswoman, But she didn't let him finish. "Senator, I didn't interrupt you. Please extend the same courtesy." He froze. She turned back to Chairman Wilson. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I reserve the remainder of my time for closing remarks, including the reading of this letter." Then she sat down. The tension didn't break. It thickened. Levin tapped his pen against the desk, but no words came. Across the room, journalists leaned forward. Pens paused mid-sentence. Families clutched each other's hands. A veteran in the front row wiped at the corner of his eye. Even Wilson took a moment before calling the next speaker. Later in the hallway, a junior reporter whispered into a recorder, "This is going to be the moment, the one they'll clip, replay, analyze." In her office, Jasmine didn't replay it. She didn't linger. She simply placed the envelope back inside the folder, zipped it shut, and handed it to Avery. "Lock this," she said. "We'll need it tomorrow." Avery nodded. "You're sure you want to wait?" Jasmine looked out the window. The trees on Constitution Avenue were nearly bare now. The wind had picked up. "Yes," she said. "Let him rest on that laugh a little longer, because tomorrow that letter would speak, and the laugh would die in its echo." The next day, the hearing room felt different. Nobody said it out loud, but everybody knew something big was coming. Cameras were set up earlier than usual. Reporters had claimed every seat, their laptops open, fingers ready. Gallery seats filled with veterans, military spouses, children in school uniforms sitting nervously beside their parents. The mood wasn't tense. It was reverent, like before a eulogy or a storm. Mark Levin arrived 15 minutes late. He looked tired. Not physically, Levin was still tall, broad-shouldered, well-groomed, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who'd started to understand what he had walked into the day before. His staff tried to make light conversation as they walked in. Nobody laughed. Jasmine was already seated, folder resting on the desk before her, perfectly square. Avery stood behind her, holding the tablet with backup documents. Neither of them smiled. Chairman Wilson opened the session with minimal preamble. He mentioned continuing yesterday's discussion on military readiness and the impact of promotion delays. Then he nodded. "Congresswoman Crockett, I believe you have closing remarks to deliver from yesterday's session." She stood slowly. "No rush, no theatrics." "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday I spoke about my experience growing up in a military family. I referenced a letter from my father, Master Sergeant James Crockett, United States Air Force, retired. Today, with your permission, I'd like to read that letter into the congressional record." Wilson gave a nod of approval. Jasmine opened the folder. She didn't fumble. Her fingers moved with intention. She unfolded the handwritten letter with the kind of care you give something sacred. She didn't clear her throat. She just began. To Senator Mark Levin. The room, packed to the walls, went absolutely still. "I am Master Sergeant James Crockett, United States Air Force, retired. I am writing this letter through my daughter because your recent actions and comments have deeply insulted every service member and military family in this country." Levin didn't move. He stared straight ahead. "My daughter, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, asked you yesterday why military families are being punished for your political choices." You laughed. You dismissed her question like it came from someone unworthy. "Let me tell you what she knows that you clearly do not." Jasmine's voice didn't waver. It didn't rise. It simply filled the room like wind rising through a canyon, soft but unstoppable. She knows that when you block promotions, you block housing assignments. You stall school enrollments. You delay medical coverage. You take food off dinner tables. These aren't theoretical effects. These are real people, real families, living with real consequences. She paused, but not for dramatic effect. She paused because her father had in the letter. She knows this because she lived it, because she watched her mother keep the house running while I deployed again and again, because she saw what it meant when I came home with scars I couldn't explain, because she heard the names of the men I left behind in jungles halfway around the world. Somewhere in the gallery someone sniffed, quiet but real. She knows what military service costs not just the service member, but everyone around them. And she knows that real leadership doesn't make those people collateral damage. Jasmine looked up not at Levin, but at the gallery. "At one point yesterday, you compared coaching football to military leadership. Let me speak to that as someone who's done one of those things." She glanced at the letter. "Coaching boys through a game is not the same as sending men into combat. Coaching means calling plays. Combat means writing letters to mothers explaining why their sons won't come home. One is a game. The other is life and death." Jasmine's voice cracked slightly. "Not weakness, resonance. You may not have meant to insult my daughter. You may not have meant to insult military families. But that's the problem, Senator. You didn't think. You didn't consider the impact. You didn't understand what you were laughing at." Levin had lowered his gaze by now. His hands were folded on the desk, still, silent. Jasmine read on. "My daughter has more understanding of military sacrifice in her little finger than most politicians develop in a lifetime. Not because she read about it, because she lived it, because she folded uniforms, cried in silence, waited for orders, moved without notice. She knows the sound of taps at a funeral. She knows the silence of absence. The room was dead quiet. You could hear a camera lens adjusting in the back. She doesn't just talk about supporting the troops. She does it. She writes policy. She shows up. She fights. That's more than most who speak in platitudes while families are torn apart by your decisions. Jasmine unfolded the final paragraph slowly. So the next time you want to laugh at someone's military knowledge, Senator, remember some of us earned ours through blood and sand, sweat and silence. We didn't inherit it. We carried it. We buried it. And we taught it to our children. She folded the letter. Then quietly she said, "Signed Master Sergeant James Crockett, United States Air Force retired. Proud father of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." Silence. Not the stunned kind, not the awkward kind, the sacred kind. Chairman Wilson blinked hard, cleared his throat, and said softly, "Let the record show that the letter from Master Sergeant James Crockett will be entered into the official record." No one clapped. No one dared. The hearing ended without a closing statement from Levin. He stood, then sat back down. He finally rose again, looked briefly toward Jasmine. Not to challenge, not to argue, but with the humbled expression of a man who had come to the edge of something he didn't understand and maybe never would. Jasmine didn't look back. She left the chamber without a word, letter still in hand, her head high. By nightfall, the letter had been watched, clipped, quoted, and replayed more times than anyone could count. The video of Jasmine Crockett reading her father's words was everywhere. Facebook, Twitter, MSNBC, even Fox News ran it, though their anchors struggled to frame it without lending it too much weight. Military families were posting it with captions like, "Finally someone said it, and this is what we've been screaming into the void." It wasn't just politics anymore. It was personal. Veterans groups, the ones politicians usually dragged out for photo ops, were releasing statements, not carefully worded PR-safe blurbs, but raw reactions. The American Legion's national commander called it a moment of rare truth in a sea of political noise. A retired Navy admiral tweeted, "Master Sergeant Crockett just did more to defend the dignity of the uniform than half the Senate has done in a decade." By morning, newspapers from New York to Boise ran front-page stories with headlines like, "The Letter That Shook the Hill," and "A Veteran's Voice Stops a Senator Cold." Even the Pentagon weighed in carefully, diplomatically, but clearly rattled. A spokesperson said, "The department respects all who speak on behalf of service members and their families, and we are reviewing the broader impacts of ongoing promotion delays." Translation: "We're feeling the heat." Inside Levin's office, things weren't much calmer. His staff scrambled to write statements, edit old tweets, delete one particularly unfortunate clip from 6 months ago where Levin had joked that deployments build character for the kids too. His comms director quit by Thursday. Levin himself canceled 3 scheduled interviews and was notably absent from a defense industry roundtable he had previously headlined. When asked by reporters for comment, he offered a single sentence, "I respect all military service, and I'm reflecting deeply on what was shared this week." It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't defiance either. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett didn't give interviews. She didn't tweet the video. She didn't need to. The letter was speaking for itself. What she did do was meet quietly with military family advocates, veteran support groups, and policy staff. Her office doubled the number of constituent calls it was taking. People weren't just calling to say thank you. They were calling to tell their stories, to say, "That's my dad, that's my kid, that's what we've been living." One military wife from Florida called, crying. "I don't even like politics," she said. "But when your dad said we were more than talking points, I felt like someone finally saw us." A retired Army sergeant major showed up unannounced with a bouquet of red, white, and blue carnations and said, "This is for the Congresswoman, and this one's for the Master Sergeant." Jasmine took it all in quietly. She knew it wasn't about her. It wasn't even about her dad. It was about what had been broken for a long time, and how a single moment of honesty had cracked it open for the world to see. But she wasn't naive. Not everyone was moved. Some conservative media outlets tried to spin the letter as emotional blackmail. One op-ed called it weaponized sentimentality, claiming that real policy shouldn't be influenced by sob stories from family members. But that take didn't land, because it was never just a sob story. It was service. It was sacrifice. It was earned. And people knew the difference. In Congress, the pressure mounted. A group of moderate Republicans, some of whom had privately voiced discomfort with Levin's promotion blocks, began publicly calling for a resolution. Senator Julian Rios of Arizona told the press, "I don't agree with every position Congresswoman Crockett holds. But her father's letter reminded me why we're supposed to be here in the first place." Within 10 days, a bipartisan resolution was introduced to expedite certain backlogged military promotions. Levin didn't co-sponsor it, but he didn't block it either. That silence spoke volumes. Back in Texas, Jasmine flew home for the weekend. At her parents' house, her dad was sitting on the back porch with a cigar and a cup of coffee, looking out at nothing in particular. When she walked out, he didn't turn to her right away. "Did I cause trouble?" he asked, half smiling. She sat beside him. "No, Daddy. You told the truth." He nodded. "Well, I'm glad it mattered." She leaned her head on his shoulder. It mattered. Then they just sat. No cameras, no headlines, just a daughter and her father, a congresswoman and a master sergeant, both tired, both proud, both knowing the weight of what had passed and what still lay ahead. 3 months later, people were still talking about the letter. Not just in Washington, not just in Texas, but on military bases in Germany, in barbershops in Georgia, in classrooms in North Carolina where high school seniors asked their JROTC instructors, "Did you hear what her dad wrote?" It had become more than a moment. It was a marker. Policy-wise, the ripple effects were clear. The Senate, pushed by public pressure, finally moved to clear the backlog of military promotions. Not all of them, but enough to ease the immediate damage. The Pentagon updated internal guidance to avoid future political stalls with such devastating family-level impacts. A new bipartisan task force formed quietly without fanfare to re-examine how military families were being factored into legislative decisions. But it wasn't just laws or procedures that changed. It was how people talked. Suddenly, military family wasn't a soft term for politicians to throw around in speeches. It meant something again. It had weight. It came with a face and a voice. Master Sergeant James Crockett's words had done what years of white papers and briefings never could. They had made people listen. At the Naval Academy, a professor added the letter to his syllabus for an ethics and leadership course. This, he told his students, is what moral authority looks like. Not the loudest voice, the most earned. At Fort Carson, a chaplain quoted the letter during a Memorial Day service, reading the line, "We didn't inherit it. We carried it. We buried it. We taught it to our children." Several in the audience quietly wiped their eyes. Political candidates, even those who didn't share Jasmine Crockett's party, began treading more carefully when discussing military service. Because the line had been drawn. You couldn't just wear a flag pin and call yourself a patriot anymore. You had to mean it. And people were watching. Levin. He didn't lose his seat. Not yet. But his polling took a hit, and the image of his smirk fading during that hearing haunted every public appearance. His party colleagues started keeping distance when military issues came up. He still spoke, but fewer listened. Jasmine, meanwhile, saw her platform expand. She became the go-to lawmaker for Veterans Affairs interviews, not because she chased them, but because she didn't have to. Her credibility was earned, not marketed. Her staff started fielding calls from new offices across the aisle. "We want to do something for the families. Can you help us get it right?" She never used the moment to grandstand, never reposted the clip. But when the opportunity came to push for improved mental health support for military spouses, she didn't hesitate. And this time, people signed on faster than usual. Because they knew she wasn't just talking, she was remembering. Back home, Master Sergeant Crockett never claimed credit. He didn't do interviews. He refused a podcast offer from a popular veteran host with 1 million subscribers. The letter was for her, he told Jasmine. It just happened to land a little louder than I expected. But at the VA center near their town, something changed. People started approaching him, younger vets, struggling ones who didn't usually talk. They didn't ask for help directly. They just sat near him. Said things like, "That letter? That was my mom? That was my wife?" One day a woman brought her son, maybe 9 years old. She knelt beside Crockett's chair and said he wanted to meet a real one. A real what? He asked, confused, a real man who told the truth, even when it hurt. The boy handed him a drawing stick figures with tiny American flags, one labeled, "My Dad," another labeled, "That Guy from the Letter." Crockett kept it in his wallet. The world didn't transform overnight. Promotion fights still happened. Political games still played out. But something had shifted. A reminder had been planted that patriotism wasn't volume, it was sacrifice. That leadership wasn't theater, it was responsibility. That sometimes the most powerful thing in a hearing room full of microphones is a quiet voice carrying the weight of lived truth. And that a letter, just one written by a father to defend his daughter, could break through all the noise. Sometimes all it takes is a quiet voice in a noisy room to remind us who we are. That's what stayed with me long after the cameras shut off and the headlines faded. Not the politics, not the confrontation, but the silence that followed a father's words and the truth they carried. There was no shouting, no grandstanding, just a letter from an old soldier standing up for his daughter, and in doing so, standing up for every military family, every overlooked sacrifice, every moment of service that too often goes unseen. And within that stillness came a shift in how we speak, how we listen, and how we treat those whose struggles aren't always visible on the surface. This story reminded us that dignity isn't loud, it's firm, and justice doesn't always arrive in power suits or press briefings. Sometimes it comes in faded uniforms, handwritten notes, and the courage to speak when silence feels safer. For the Black community especially, this was more than a political moment. It was a reflection of generations who've had to fight twice as hard just to be heard once, of families who carry the weight of both service and silence. The lesson here: never underestimate someone based on where they come from or how they appear. The truth and the strength to carry it often lives in the places most easily dismissed. Whether it's a congresswoman brushed off for her looks or a retired master sergeant dismissed as just a parent, we are all more than the surface allows. Especially in the Black community, where strength and grace so often coexist, quietly unnoticed, until they are called forward. And maybe that's why this story matters so much. Because in the smallest gesture, a letter read aloud, a daughter refusing to flinch a room held still by earned respect, we saw something bigger than politics. We saw what it means to answer mockery with memory, to meet dismissal with dignity, to fight not with fire, but with truth shaped by sacrifice. Like the porch light left on at night for someone making their way home, even a single act of courage can guide others through their darkest hour. So tonight, maybe take a moment to sit with that. Think about who in your life has lit that kind of light for you, or who still waits in silence, hoping someone will see them. If this story touched your heart, maybe share it not for clicks, but to remind someone they're not alone. The Black community, the military families, and so many others still walk through shadows that deserve more light. Let's be that light when we can.